At the end of a quiet shelter hallway, one German Shepherd puppy refused to stop talking. Families laughed, recorded her, then chose quieter dogs and walked away. Every night she pressed against the kennel beside hers and whispered to an old dog who could no longer hear. Then a Navy SEAL arrived carrying a brand new leash, looking for a calm companion and a home without noise. The puppy saw him, stood at the bars, and began speaking in a voice she had never used before. Why did she grow louder whenever he sat alone? What had taught such a young dog to fear silence? And when the woman who had searched for her finally arrived, which home would the puppy choose? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late autumn rested over Harrisonburg, Virginia, turning the Blue Ridge foothills copper beneath a cold, gray rain. At the edge of town stood the Shenandoah County Animal Haven, a modest brick shelter that always seemed to have more animals than space and more hope than money. The last kennel in the main corridor belonged to Sadie, a 9-week-old female German Shepherd with black and tan fur, oversized paws, and the grave expression of a tiny judge. Her right ear stood proudly upright, her left folded sideways at the tip, ruining every attempt at dignity. Sadie did not bark like the other puppies. She made low, raspy sounds that rose, dipped, paused, and began again as though she were building sentences from a language only she understood. Children laughed and parents filmed her. Yet when adoption papers appeared, most families moved toward quieter kennels. People often claimed they wanted a dog with personality. What many meant was personality that knew when to be convenient. Sadie watched each family leave, went silent for a few breaths, then turned toward the next footsteps and started again. Claire Dawson had noticed. Claire was 62, tall and lean, with warm brown skin, silver-streaked black hair cut at her jaw, and reading glasses that constantly slipped down her nose. After 37 years as a middle school secretary, she could calm frightened children and recognize sadness beneath a cheerful voice. Retirement had lasted 9 days before the quiet sent her to volunteer at the shelter. During the day, Sadie talked to everyone. At night, her voice changed. In the kennel beside hers lived Walter, a 13-year-old hound mix with drooping ears, cloudy brown eyes, stiff legs, and a muzzle turned almost white. Age had taken most of his hearing. Walter slept through barking, clanging gates, and storms. Still, every night Sadie pressed against the divider and murmured to him through the wire. Walter could not hear her, but whenever Sadie's chest touched the metal, his tail gave one slow thump against the floor. Claire began to suspect that certain voices were meant to be felt rather than heard. Across town, Ruth Bennett stood in her kitchen holding an apple pie meant for the new neighbor. Ruth was 72, short and softly rounded, with pale freckled skin, gray curls, and bright blue eyes. A retired children's librarian, she still wore pressed cardigans and sensible shoes. Her husband, Henry, had died 22 months earlier. Since then, Ruth had become skilled at sounding cheerful in public and making almost no sound at home. The new renter across the street was Michael Turner. Ruth knew he was 38, served in the Navy, and had arrived carrying one arm carefully near his side. 3 times she had taken the pie to her front door. 3 times she had seen Michael's curtains closed and decided not to intrude. She told herself an injured man deserved privacy. He did not admit that after Henry died, friends had also offered her space until space slowly became absence. That rainy morning, Michael entered the shelter carrying a brand new blue leash. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an athletic build weakened slightly by recovery. His dark brown hair was clipped short, faint gray touched his temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw. A small scar crossed beneath his chin. His canvas jacket hid little of the stiffness in his right shoulder. Michael had spent most of his adult life as a Navy SEAL, trained to move toward danger while others moved away. 4 months earlier, A training accident had torn ligaments in his shoulder and shaken something deeper than muscle. He was on medical leave, living alone and telling everyone he needed time to heal. In truth, Michael wanted a companion that would ask nothing, notice little, and leave the silence undisturbed. He had chosen the calm, older Labrador mix named Cooper from the shelter website. Gentle, independent, low energy. The words sounded less like a dog and more like permission to remain unchanged. At the front desk, Claire told him Cooper had been adopted by a retired couple that morning. "That's good," Michael answered too quickly. Claire recognized the tone. It was how people spoke when they wanted disappointment to behave itself. "You can still look around," she said. Michael almost declined. Then a strange, gravelly voice drifted down the hallway, rising and falling with surprising emphasis. "What is that?" "That," Claire said, pushing up her glasses, "is Sadie expressing an opinion." Michael followed the sound past rows of hopeful eyes until he reached the final kennel. Sadie stood with both front paws against the wire, speaking with urgent concentration. The moment Michael appeared, she stopped. For several seconds they studied each other. Michael saw an untidy puppy with one unreliable ear and no respect for quiet. Sadie saw a large man whose face appeared calm, while his left hand gripped an empty leash and his right arm remained guarded. Michael had spent years reading rooms, exits, shadows, and human intentions. He was less prepared to be examined by a creature who still tripped over her own paws. Sadie sat down and made a softer sound. Michael should have smiled and walked away. Instead, he crouched carefully until his face was level with hers. "You have something important to say?" Sadie answered immediately. 3 low notes, a questioning rise, a breath, then another determined rumble. Her crooked ear twitched. Michael's mouth shifted before he could stop it, not quite a smile, but close enough for Claire to notice. "She does that all day," Claire said. "People laugh, then choose another dog." Michael looked toward Walter's kennel. The old hound slept with his white muzzle resting on his paws. "She talks to him every night," Claire added. "He can barely hear anything." Michael watched Sadie press her nose between the bars. It seemed foolish, tender, and strangely honorable to keep speaking to someone who could not answer. Human beings often stopped trying after a single silence. Then Claire's expression changed. "There is one thing you should know. Sadie has already been reserved. A woman in Tennessee completed the paperwork. She'll come for her in 14 days. Michael looked at the narrow kennel, the concrete floor, and the puppy who had never learned that being passed over was a reason to stop trying. He had come seeking a dog who would not disturb his silence. Instead, the loudest animal in the building was staring at him as though silence itself were the danger. "Until she comes," Michael asked, "could I foster her?" Sadie stopped talking for exactly 1 second. Then the little German shepherd began again at twice the volume. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned into a silver mist over Harrisonburg, leaving the roads dark and shining beneath the bare branches. Michael Turner drove away from the shelter with Sadie on the passenger side floor of his pickup, a folded foster agreement in the glove compartment, and the brand-new blue leash looped around his left wrist. Claire had provided a small bag of puppy food, a faded blanket, 2 rubber toys, and enough warnings to make the arrangement sound less like fostering a dog and more like supervising a cheerful criminal. Sadie had talked through the entire paperwork process. She complained when Claire checked her collar, objected to being weighed, and delivered an especially passionate speech when Michael lifted her into the truck instead of allowing her to climb in alone. Once the shelter disappeared behind them, however, Sadie became silent. He stood with her front paws on the edge of the seat and stared through the windshield as wet fields and red barns passed beneath the gray sky. Michael glanced down at her several times. The sudden quiet should have pleased him. Instead, he found himself wondering whether she understood that she was leaving the only place she currently knew. 14 days, he said. Temporary arrangement. Sadie turned her head and gave him one short, doubtful sound. Michael had briefed experienced soldiers who looked less openly unconvinced. The rental house stood on a quiet street near the lower slopes of the Blue Ridge, a narrow two-story home with cream siding, dark green shutters, and a front porch that sagged slightly on one corner. Michael had moved in 6 weeks earlier, yet the rooms still looked borrowed. A few framed photographs remained inside cardboard boxes. His books stood in straight rows because order was easier than decoration. The living room held a brown sofa, a wooden coffee table, one lamp, and a television he rarely turned on. Nothing in the house suggested that a person had chosen it. It looked like a place someone had been assigned to wait. Michael carried Sadie inside and set her on the entryway rug. The puppy sniffed the air, looked toward the living room, then back at him as if requesting a formal explanation. Michael unclipped the leash and crouched carefully, protecting his injured shoulder. "There are 4 rules," he said. Sadie sat down, one ear upright and the other tilting sideways. "No sofa, no bedroom, no chewing shoes, and no waking me before 6. Sadie listened with solemn attention. For 3 full seconds, Michael believed they had reached an understanding. Sadie walked directly into the living room, attempted to jump onto the sofa, missed, and landed backward on the rug. She stood, shook herself with offended dignity, tried again, and succeeded. Michael stared at her. Sadie turned twice, curled into the corner cushion, and released a satisfied rumble. That was the first rule. Sadie closed her eyes. Michael lifted her down. She climbed back up while he was carrying the food bag into the kitchen. The second violation involved his boots. Michael removed them by the door, then went upstairs to find an old towel for Sadie's wet paws. When he returned, one boot had disappeared. He found it beneath the coffee table with Sadie's head buried inside it. She backed out, sneezed, and began talking as though the smell had personally insulted her. Michael rescued the boot, pointed at it, and said, "No." Sadie licked his finger. 10 minutes later, the other boot appeared in the upstairs hallway, although Michael never saw how she managed to drag it up 3 steps before abandoning the effort. Dinner created the first serious disagreement. Michael measured the portion Claire had recommended, placed the steel bowl on the kitchen floor, and asked Sadie to sit. Sadie sat. Michael lowered the bowl. Sadie lunged. Michael raised it. Sadie produced a long, indignant woo that rose sharply at the end. "You sit until I say." Another woo, shorter but more argumentative. They repeated the exchange 4 times. On the 5th attempt, Sadie remained seated, though every muscle in her small body leaned toward the food. Michael gave the command. She buried her face in the bowl, scattering half the meal across the floor, then paused midway to look up and comment on the service. Michael had spent years around working dogs. He respected their discipline, intelligence, and ability to perform under pressure. Sadie possessed intelligence, certainly, but discipline appeared to be an idea she considered unnecessarily restrictive. She followed the vacuum cleaner around the living room, barking once and then switching to her raspy commentary when the machine failed to retreat. She attempted to climb onto the kitchen chair during Michael's dinner and responded to his refusal with the wounded expression of someone denied a constitutional right. When he drove to a nearby convenience store for milk and paper towels, Sadie sat secured beside him and narrated every passing truck, pedestrian, and traffic light. Her pitch rose when a golden retriever appeared on the sidewalk, then became suspiciously low when a plastic bag blew across the parking lot. Inside the store, Michael left Sadie in the truck only long enough to pay. Through the window, he could see her standing with both front paws against the glass, addressing a display of windshield washer fluid. The cashier, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a shaved head and a patient face, glanced outside and said, "Your dog looks like she's filing a complaint." Michael looked toward the truck. "She's temporary." The cashier gave him the mild smile of a man who had heard many people lie to themselves in ordinary places. "Sure she is." That evening, Michael sat on the sofa with an ice pack over his shoulder. Sadie climbed up beside him before he could object and settled against his left thigh. He considered moving her. Instead, he remained still. The house had always seemed quietest at this hour. after daylight disappeared but before exhaustion made sleep possible. Michael usually heard the refrigerator cycle on, the heating pipes knock, and the clock on the wall count the seconds with unnecessary confidence. Now Sadie made small noises in her sleep. Her paws twitched, her folded ear moved as though following a distant sound. The room felt less empty, though nothing in it had changed except the presence of a creature who had already ignored most of his instructions. Michael eventually carried Sadie to the blanket beside the kitchen doorway. "You sleep here." Sadie yawned. Michael went upstairs, closed his bedroom door, and lay down. Less than an hour later, a low voice began outside the room. It started as a murmur, then grew into a series of rising complaints. Michael opened the door. Sadie sat in the hallway beside his missing shoe. The bedside clock read 9:17 p.m. "That does not technically violate the fourth rule," Michael admitted. Sadie walked past him into the bedroom, dragged the shoe beneath the bed, and curled up on the rug. Michael was too tired to negotiate. The next morning, she woke him at 5:42 by placing both front paws on the mattress and speaking directly into his ear. Michael opened one eye. Sadie's face was inches from his, grave and expectant. 18 minutes, he said. Sadie continued. He pulled the blanket over his head. She grabbed one corner and pulled backward until his injured shoulder protested. Michael sat up with a sharp breath. Sadie immediately released the blanket and went silent, watching him carefully. There was something in that pause that felt different from disobedience. Michael rubbed the shoulder, then reached down with his good hand. Sadie licked his knuckles once before resuming her morning speech at a more reasonable volume. By the second afternoon, the rain had cleared, and weak sunlight rested on the wet lawns. Michael opened the back door to let Sadie into the fenced yard. He stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee while she attacked a pile of leaves, lost an argument with a twig, and discovered a narrow gap beneath the fence. By the time Michael noticed, only her hind legs were visible. "Sadie!" The legs vanished. Michael set down the coffee and hurried around the house. He found her across the street in Ruth Bennett's yard. Ruth sat on her front steps wearing a lavender cardigan over a blue dress, her gray curls bright in the sunlight. Sadie had positioned herself between Ruth's sensible shoes and was talking with the confidence of a guest who had arrived by appointment. "I believe your dog came to inspect me," Ruth said. "She's not my dog. I'm fostering her." "Then your temporary supervisor has concerns." Michael approached, slightly breathless and embarrassed. Ruth's porch smelled faintly of apples and cinnamon. A covered pie rested on the small table beside her. "I meant to bring that over," Ruth said, following his glance. "3 times actually, but your curtains were closed." "You could have knocked." "I could have." Ruth smoothed a hand over her cardigan. "After Henry died, people told me they didn't want to intrude. I began using the same excuse with everyone else. It's easier than discovering whether you're welcome." Sadie placed one oversized paw on Ruth's shoe and made a soft sound. Ruth looked down at her. "Henry talked constantly. Weather, baseball, grocery prices, people he hadn't seen since 1984. He even talked through movies and then asked me what happened." Her smile arrived gently and left almost as quickly. "Now I sometimes leave the radio on in the bedroom while I'm in the kitchen. It sounds foolish, but it makes the house feel occupied." "It doesn't sound foolish," Michael said. He surprised himself by meaning it. "Would you like some coffee?" he asked. "I have coffee. The pie could come with you." Ruth glanced toward his house. "I wouldn't want to be a bother." Before Michael could answer, Sadie caught the lower edge of Ruth's cardigan between her teeth and pulled toward the sidewalk. Ruth laughed, a clear and startled sound. "Good heavens! She's 40 centimeters tall and already has no respect for personal boundaries." Michael freed the fabric from Sadie's mouth. "That makes 2 of us she doesn't listen to." They crossed the street together. Ruth carried the pie. Michael carried Sadie when the puppy stopped halfway to argue with a storm drain. They sat at Michael's kitchen table for nearly an hour. Ruth told him about her years as a children's librarian, about Henry's habit of returning books late despite living with a librarian, and about the neighborhood before half the old families moved away. Michael spoke less, but he answered when she asked questions. He did not explain the full extent of his injury or the uncertainty waiting behind his next medical appointment. Still, when Ruth asked whether recovery was going well, he did not say perfectly. He said, slowly. Throughout the conversation, Sadie lay beneath the table with her head resting on Ruth's slipper. The puppy, who had argued with bowls, furniture, shoes, traffic, and household appliances, made almost no sound at all. As dusk settled, Ruth returned across the street. Michael stood at the window with Sadie in his arms and watched her unlock the door of the dark house. Ruth paused inside, framed briefly by the porch light, then disappeared behind the curtains. Sadie grew still. A moment later she began to speak in a voice Michael had not heard before. Lower, slower, and patient enough to continue without an answer. Michael looked from the puppy to Ruth's unlit window. For the first time he wondered whether Sadie talked because she wanted someone to hear her, or because she had recognized someone who had been silent for far too long. Over the next 4 days, cold sunlight returned to Harrisonburg, spreading across the Blue Ridge in pale bands, while the last autumn leaves collected along the curbs. Michael's house no longer woke quietly. Each morning began with Sadie sitting outside his bedroom, offering a serious report on matters that apparently could not wait until breakfast. She argued with the kettle when it began to whistle, complained when her food required more than 5 seconds to reach the floor, and once spent several minutes addressing her reflection in the oven door. Yet Michael began to notice that Sadie's noisiest moments were not always the happiest ones. When Michael walked her through the neighborhood, Sadie bounced through piles of leaves and made brief, excited noises at squirrels, bicycles, and one deeply suspicious garden statue. When Ruth sat at his kitchen table, Sadie often settled beneath it and remained quiet. When Michael repaired a loose cabinet hinge or sorted laundry, she followed him without much commentary. But if he forgot lunch, Sadie sat beside the refrigerator and began a slow, persistent speech. If he remained in the dark living room after sunset, she abandoned her toys and pressed against his leg. If his shoulder began to tremble during rehabilitation exercises, the playful sounds vanished completely. Michael first dismissed the pattern as coincidence. Human beings were skilled at seeing intention where none existed. Sailors gave personalities to storms, drivers blamed traffic lights for personal grudges, and lonely people often imagined animals understood more than they did. Michael had always trusted measurable facts over comforting interpretations. Still, Sadie's timing became increasingly difficult to ignore. Each morning, Michael followed a recovery routine prescribed by the military medical team. He anchored a resistance band to the stair rail, performed controlled rotations, and recorded the results in a notebook. Progress was measured in small numbers that seemed insulting beside the strength he once possessed. 4 months earlier, he could carry equipment over rough ground for hours. Now, 8 careful repetitions could leave his right hand shaking. One morning, Michael pushed beyond the recommended limit. He reached the 10th repetition, jaw clenched, breath held. Pain traveled from his shoulder into his neck. Sadie had been chewing a rubber ring near the sofa. She stopped immediately. Michael attempted another pull. Sadie crossed the room, placed one paw on the resistance band, and began speaking in a low, measured tone. "I'm fine," Michael told her. Sadie continued. He pulled again. The band slipped slightly in his weakened grip. Sadie grabbed it and backed away, dragging the rubber from his hand. Michael stared at her. "That is medical equipment." Sadie carried it beneath the dining table and sat on it. For a moment, irritation rose in him. Then he noticed his fingers trembling. He lowered himself onto the bottom stair and waited for the shaking to pass. Sadie emerged, left the band on the floor, and leaned against his knee without making another sound. The fact unsettled him more than the pain. Ruth's visits became almost daily, though she never admitted that visiting was the reason she came. On Monday, she returned a teaspoon Michael had never seen before. On Tuesday, she asked to borrow sugar while carrying a grocery bag containing an unopened 5-pound package. On Wednesday, she appeared at the door to ask whether Sadie had eaten the mail carrier. "I haven't seen the mail carrier," Michael said. "Exactly," Ruth replied. "Suspicious." Ruth entered wearing a rust-colored cardigan, navy slacks, and the mild expression of a woman pretending she had not prepared the joke hours earlier. Sadie greeted her with a short burst of enthusiasm, then settled near her feet. Michael made coffee while Ruth examined the teaspoon she had brought. "This one isn't mine," he said. "I wondered why it looked so respectable. You crossed the street to give me someone else's spoon?" "I'm 72. I'm allowed one confusing errand before noon." Michael found himself smiling more often around Ruth. She did not ask direct questions about his injury, and he did not ask why her visits always ended before the houses across the street began switching on their evening lights. They allowed each other certain evasions. People often called that politeness, though sometimes it was simply fear wearing better clothes. That afternoon, Ruth noticed an envelope from the local library on Michael's counter. It had been delivered to the wrong address. "They still send me the club schedule," she said. "You were in a book club?" "For 21 years. Ruth turned the envelope over, but did not open it. "Henry came with me after retirement. He rarely finished the books, but that never stopped him from having the strongest opinion." "Why did you stop going?" Ruth looked toward Sadie, who was asleep beneath the table with her chin on Ruth's slipper. "The chair beside mine belonged to Henry," she said. "After he died, everyone kept leaving it empty. At first I thought it was kind. Then I began to feel as though they were all watching that chair to see how well I behaved beside it." Michael understood the cruelty of gentle attention. Sympathy could become another kind of spotlight. It asked grieving people to perform dignity so others would feel less helpless. "You could keep his chair," Michael said. Ruth gave him a small, guarded look. "But that doesn't mean every other chair has to stay empty." Ruth looked down at the unopened envelope. "That sounds almost wise." "Don't tell anyone." "I wouldn't damage your reputation." Sadie opened one eye, made a soft, approving sound, then went back to sleep. The military doctor called the following afternoon. Commander Rebecca Sloan appeared on Michael's laptop screen from a medical office in Norfolk. She was 45, lean and straight-backed with fair skin, sharp gray eyes, and auburn hair cut in a practical bob. A narrow white scar crossed her left eyebrow, the result of a vehicle accident early in her naval career. She was known for speaking gently without softening facts, a habit that had earned both trust and resentment from patients who wanted hope delivered without conditions. Rebecca reviewed Michael's latest imaging and rehabilitation notes. "The repair is holding," she said, "but the nerve response is slower than we expected." "How much slower?" "Enough that I can't give you a reliable return date." Michael kept his face still. "But a return is still possible." "Possible is not the same as probable." He looked past the screen toward the folded uniform hanging inside the hall closet. "What are you recommending?" "More time, less aggressive training, and preparation for the possibility that your previous operational role may not be available." Michael heard every word. He also heard the life behind those words quietly changing shape. "I understand," he said. Rebecca watched him for a moment. "Understanding information and accepting it are different processes." "I said I understand." "Yes," she replied. "That's usually what worries me." After the call ended, Michael closed the laptop. He did not eat. He did not switch on the lamps when evening entered the room. He drew the curtains, sat on the sofa, and stared at the dark television screen. Sadie was asleep in the kitchen, curled beside her water bowl. Michael had made no sound, yet within a minute the puppy lifted her head. He walked into the living room without excitement. No toy hung from her mouth. Her tail did not wag. She came directly to Michael, pushed her small body against his shin, and began speaking. The sound was low and steady, neither a bark nor a whine. It continued in patient phrases, pausing only long enough for breath. Michael looked down at her. "You can't fix this." Sadie leaned harder against him and kept talking. "I don't know what happens next." The puppy answered with another grave, rumbling sentence. Michael's first instinct was to stand, turn on the lights, and do something useful. Action had always been his escape from uncertainty. But there was nothing to lift, repair, map, or defeat, so he remained seated while Sadie spoke into the darkness. After several minutes, Michael rested his left hand on her back. Sadie's voice softened, but did not stop. It felt less like being comforted and more like being counted, as though the little dog were checking again and again to make certain he had not disappeared inside himself. The following morning, sunlight struck the front window, and Sadie stood with her paws on the sill, chattering brightly at a crow on Ruth's fence. Michael recorded a short video and sent it to Claire. "She sounds happy," he wrote. Claire's reply arrived before he put the phone down. "That isn't the voice she used here." A second message followed, containing a video recorded at 2 in the morning. Michael pressed play. The shelter corridor was dark except for a dim safety light. Sadie lay against the divider beside Walter's kennel, her tiny ribs touching the wire. She murmured in that same low, steady rhythm Michael had heard in the dark living room. Walter remained asleep, his frosted muzzle resting on his paws. The old dog could not hear her. But each time Sadie's chest vibrated against the barrier, Walter's tail gave a slow, gentle thump against the floor. The next week brought colder nights to Harrisonburg, and the mountains beyond the town lost the last of their bright leaves. Bare branches scratched against the pale sky, and the wind carried the dry smell of wood smoke through the neighborhood. Inside Michael Turner's rented house, Sadie continued to study him with the solemn attention of a creature who had not yet learned that human beings considered concealment a form of dignity. The more Michael understood the different voices she used, the less comfortable he became beneath her gaze. Sadie noticed when he pushed breakfast around a plate and left it untouched. She noticed when he rose before dawn after sleeping only an hour. She noticed when he stood in front of the hall closet with one hand resting on the door, staring at the navy uniform hanging inside, as though it belonged to a man who had moved away without leaving an address. At first, Michael tried distracting her. He tossed rubber toys down the hallway, opened the back door, or gave her simple commands to practice. Sadie obeyed when obedience suited her, but she always returned. If Michael's breathing changed, her playful chatter faded. If his hand tightened around a coffee mug, she sat closer. The little German shepherd did not demand explanations. She simply made that low, patient sound until Michael either moved, ate, or acknowledged her. Human beings often said they wanted to be understood without having to speak. What they rarely admitted was how frightening it could feel when something actually understood them. The anniversary arrived on a cold Thursday, beneath a sky the color of old steel. Michael knew the date before he looked at the calendar. His shoulder had stiffened during the night, and the scar beneath his chin seemed to ache with memories that had no physical cause. 1 year earlier, during a coastal training exercise in North Carolina, Michael had supervised a young operator named Daniel Reed. Daniel had been 27, compact and wiry, with sandy hair, a narrow, freckled face, and a quick grin that often appeared at the worst possible moment. He had a talent for making exhausted men laugh, and a habit of calling every terrible cup of coffee surprisingly ambitious. Daniel had married only 6 months before the accident, and carried a photograph of his wife inside a waterproof sleeve. The exercise should have ended when the weather shifted. Michael had seen the wind rising and the water growing rougher, but the team had completed difficult drills in worse conditions. He approved one final repetition. A piece of training equipment failed. Daniel survived, but the damage to his back and leg ended his operational career. Michael injured his shoulder while helping bring him to safety. Official investigations blamed worn equipment and an unexpected mechanical failure. Daniel himself never accused Michael. That forgiveness had become one of the heaviest things Michael carried. That morning, a message arrived from Daniel. Still upright, still married, coffee still terrible. Don't turn today into a funeral. Michael read it twice and did not answer. Daniel's humor was generous, but Michael could not accept generosity without wondering what debt it concealed. He placed the phone face down and opened the closet. The uniform hung perfectly pressed inside a garment bag. Michael had not worn it since the accident. He stood there too long, studying the insignia, the folded sleeves, and the shape of a life that had once required no explanation. Sadie entered the hallway carrying a frayed rope toy. She dropped it when she saw him. Her tail slowed. A low sound began in her chest. "I'm not doing this today," Michael said. Sadie sat down and continued. Michael closed the closet. She followed him into the kitchen. He poured coffee and forgot to drink it. She followed him into the living room. He switched on the television and muted it before the first sentence ended. Sadie climbed onto the rug beside his feet and produced another measured series of sounds. "I know what day it is," he said. Sadie tilted her crooked ear. "I know exactly what happened." The puppy answered softly, not because she understood the accident, but because she understood the man speaking as though facts could protect him from grief. Across the street, Ruth Bennett noticed Michael's curtains remain closed through the afternoon. She had begun to recognize the rhythm of the house. The kitchen light shortly after sunrise, the porch door opening when Sadie went outside, the brief shadow of Michael crossing the upstairs window before bed. That day, almost nothing moved. Ruth baked cornbread she did not need and placed half of it in a covered dish. Twice she carried the dish to her front hall. Twice she left it on the table. By evening, Michael had eaten nothing. Sadie sat beside the untouched plate and talked until he moved it to the counter. When he walked upstairs, she followed. When he returned to the living room, she followed again. Her persistence, which had once amused him, now felt like a hand holding open a door he desperately wanted shut. "Enough," he said, though his voice was not loud. Sadie stopped for half a breath, then resumed in the checking voice. Michael pressed his fingers against his forehead. "You don't know anything about it." Sadie came closer. "You don't know what it means to make a decision and watch someone else pay for it." The puppy placed one oversized paw on his boot. Michael stood too quickly. Sadie stepped back but did not run. He crossed the hallway, entered the bedroom, and closed the door behind him. He did not slam it. He closed it gently, carefully, as though kindness in the movement could excuse what the door was meant to do. Sadie remained outside. For several minutes her voice came through the wood in low, steady phrases. Michael sat on the edge of the bed with his hands clasped between his knees. The sounds continued, slower now. A rumble, a pause, another soft rise. Then they grew faint. Finally, Sadie stopped. That same night, Ruth saw Michael's bedroom light burning long after midnight. She put on her wool coat, picked up the covered cornbread, and crossed half the distance between their houses. The air was sharp enough to sting her eyes. She could see no movement behind his curtains. Ruth stopped beneath the street lamp. She told herself Michael was a grown man, a Navy SEAL, a person entitled to privacy. She told herself knocking might embarrass him, or force him to pretend he was fine for her comfort. Then she remembered the weeks after Henry's funeral. Friends had filled her refrigerator, folded their hands around hers, and promised to call. Afterward, they said they wanted to give her time and space. The calls became fewer, the visits stopped. Everyone behaved politely while Ruth learned how large a kitchen could become when only one chair was used. She looked toward Michael's house for another minute, then turned back. In her own kitchen, Ruth placed the cornbread on the counter and stood beside the silent radio. She understood something she wished she had understood sooner. Silence was not always peace. Sometimes it was only a room becoming large enough for a person to disappear inside it. The next morning, Sadie made no speech at the bedroom door. Michael found her sitting near the kitchen, watching him from several feet away. She ate without comment. She drank, carried her rope toy into the living room, and played alone. When Michael sat on the sofa, she chose the far end of the rug. The house had become exactly what he had wanted before she arrived: quiet, orderly, undemanding. By noon, the ticking clock seemed louder than any barking. By afternoon, Michael found himself waiting for Sadie to complain about the vacuum, the food bowl, the mail truck, anything. She remained silent. She did not punish him or hide, she simply respected the distance he had created. That was worse. Night settled over Harrisonburg. Michael opened the bedroom door and sat on the floor in the doorway. Sadie watched from across the hall, her uneven ears raised. Michael swallowed. He had delivered reports under pressure, spoken to grieving families, and given orders while men trusted his voice with their lives. The next sentence was harder than any of those. "I'm not okay," he said, "and I don't know who I'll be if I can't go back." Sadie stood. She crossed the hallway slowly, placed both front paws on his knees, and looked into his face. Then she resumed the same low sentence she had left unfinished outside the door. Michael lowered his head and laughed once, though his eyes had turned red. "All right," he whispered. "Keep talking." Cold rain settled over the Shenandoah Valley before dawn and remained there, steady and gray, washing the color from the streets of Harrisonburg. Water slipped from the bare branches, gathered along the gutters, and tapped against Michael Turner's windows with the patience of someone who expected to be invited inside. Michael woke shortly after 7 to find Sadie already sitting beside the bedroom door. Since the night he had admitted he was not all right, the little German shepherd had recovered her voice completely. She greeted him with a rolling series of sounds, followed him downstairs, and objected when breakfast required nearly 30 seconds to prepare. Yet beneath her usual commentary, Michael noticed a restlessness he could not place. Sadie ate only half her food before walking to the front window. She placed both front paws against the sill and stared through the rain at Ruth Bennett's house across the street. Ruth usually opened her kitchen curtains before 7:30. By 8, the yellow lamp above her sink would be glowing, and not long afterward she would appear at Michael's door, carrying something she claimed had arrived in her kitchen by accident. A jar of marmalade, half a loaf of bread, a magazine Michael had never subscribed to. Since their first coffee together, Ruth had created a small ceremony around not admitting she wanted company. Michael had come to respect the ceremony. People sometimes needed excuses before they could accept that loneliness was reason enough to knock. That morning, Ruth's curtains remained closed. "She's probably sleeping late," Michael told Sadie. Sadie made a low sound without turning from the window. Michael poured coffee and opened his rehabilitation notebook. He had completed only 2 exercises when Sadie began pacing from the window to the front door. Her nails clicked sharply against the floor. She returned to the glass, whined once, then produced a rapid sequence of rough sounds, unlike her playful arguments or the slow, checking voice she used when Michael withdrew into himself. "Sadie?" The puppy looked at him, ran to the door, and scratched hard enough to shake the brass mail slot. "It's pouring outside." Sadie came back, seized the lower leg of Michael's sweatpants, and pulled. The fabric stretched. Her paws slid backward on the wooden floor, but she refused to release him. Michael looked again toward Ruth's house. There was still no light, no curtain movement, no familiar gray head passing the window. A quiet home, he had learned, could mean many things: peace, sleep, privacy, or a person lying where nobody thought to look. Michael grabbed his jacket and opened the door. Sadie shot into the rain. Her paws splashed through shallow water as she crossed the street, dragging the blue leash behind her before Michael could clip it on. He followed, his injured shoulder protesting when he reached too quickly for the porch rail. Sadie ran up Ruth's steps and threw herself against the front door, her voice rising into urgent cries that sounded almost too large for her body. Michael knocked. "Ruth?" No answer. He tried the handle. The door opened. Warm air carried the scent of apples, old wood, and something faintly scorched. A kettle hissed dry on the stove. Michael moved through the narrow hallway while Sadie hurried ahead, slipping once on the polished floor. "Ruth!" A weak voice answered from the kitchen. "I am beginning to dislike mornings."
Ruth lay on her side beside the table, one hand tangled in the hem of her lavender robe. Her pale face looked smaller without color, and her gray curls were flattened against one temple. A broken cup lay several feet away, its tea spreading across the floor. He was conscious, but when Michael knelt beside her, he saw fear hiding beneath the embarrassed smile she tried to offer. "I stood up," Ruth said. Then the room apparently objected. "Don't move yet." "I wasn't planning an encore." Sadie pressed close to Ruth's shoulder and began talking in short, urgent bursts. Ruth lifted one trembling hand and rested it against the puppy's neck. "You were right," she whispered. "There. I said it. Try not to become unbearable." Michael called emergency services and turned off the stove. He checked Ruth's breathing and kept her still until the paramedics arrived. Ruth attempted to apologize for her robe, the state of the kitchen, and the fact that the cornbread on the counter was 2 days old. One paramedic, a calm young woman with dark braids and rainwater shining on her navy jacket, told Ruth that anyone who apologized during an emergency was officially well enough to be irritating. Ruth was taken to Rockingham Memorial Hospital for observation. Michael followed in his truck, with Sadie secured beside him, though the puppy protested every red light as if traffic laws had become a personal betrayal. At the hospital entrance, Michael was told Sadie could not enter beyond the waiting area. He expected a battle. Instead, Sadie sat beneath his chair, wet ears lowered, and watched every pair of shoes passing through the doors. Laura Bennett arrived less than an hour later. At 48, Ruth's only daughter was tall and narrow-shouldered, with light brown skin, dark auburn hair pulled into a practical knot, and the same bright blue eyes as her mother. Fine lines gathered between her brows from years of concentrating on problems before they fully existed. Laura worked as an office manager for a dental practice outside Charlottesville, and had built her life around schedules, emergency numbers, and making certain nothing slipped beyond her control. Her father's sudden death had strengthened that habit until love and vigilance sometimes became impossible to separate. She crossed the waiting room quickly, embraced Michael before either of them expected it, then stepped back. "You found her?" "Sadie did." Laura looked down. Sadie stared up and offered one quiet sound. "My mother has always preferred being rescued by someone she can argue with," Laura said. "A puppy may be her ideal opponent." The doctors found no serious injury. Ruth's blood pressure had dropped after she stood too quickly, likely worsened by dehydration and the fact that she had eaten almost nothing the previous evening. She had bruised her hip but broken no bones. They wanted to observe her overnight and review her medication before discharge. When Michael and Laura entered the room, Ruth was sitting upright in bed beneath a thin, white blanket, looking deeply offended by the hospital gown. "I'm going home with you," Laura announced before greeting her. Ruth's mouth tightened. "How lovely. I've always wanted to become luggage. You were alone on the floor. For less than an hour. You don't know that." Sadie knew. "That is not a safety plan, Mother." Laura's voice sharpened because fear rarely arrived sounding like fear. It arrived as instructions, criticism, and decisions made too quickly. Ruth heard control. Laura heard the possibility of finding her mother too late. Both believed they were defending love. "I will not leave my home," Ruth said. "I will not move into your guest room and become a daily project between your work and grocery shopping." "You would not be a project. Then stop discussing me like one." Michael stood near the window, uncomfortable with entering a family argument, and more uncomfortable with leaving two frightened people to wound each other through good intentions. Sadie, seated beside his boot, gave a low sound. Michael looked at Laura. She shouldn't be alone without a plan. Ruth raised her chin. "But moving her isn't the only plan." Laura folded her arms. "What do you suggest?" Michael considered the same principles that had once governed dangerous operations. Never rely on one point of failure, establish regular contact, and make sure everyone knew when silence meant trouble. They arranged for Ruth to wear an emergency alert pendant. Laura would call every morning before work.
Michael would check the kitchen curtains by 8 and cross the street if they remained closed. Ruth agreed to return to her library book club twice a week, partly for company and partly because regular absences were easier to notice when people expected someone to arrive. Ruth listened with the expression of a queen reviewing an imperfect treaty. "I will agree," she said, "on one condition." Laura sighed. "Of course there is a condition." Ruth looked at Michael. "He gets checked too." Michael blinked. "This is about you." "No, this is about people living alone and pretending that makes them invincible. You will answer when I call. You will eat something before noon, and if your curtains stay closed all day, Laura gets permission to send that puppy through the window." "That seems excessive." Sadie sat beside Ruth's bed and released one sharp, approving "whoo." Laura almost smiled. "The motion passes." Michael looked from Ruth to Laura and then down at the crooked-eared creature who had apparently been granted voting rights. "Fine, one daily check." Ruth reached for his hand. Her fingers felt cool but steady. Needing to be noticed is not the same as being helpless. Michael thought of the morning, of how easily he had almost accepted the closed curtains as a request for privacy. Human beings feared intruding because they feared rejection, embarrassment, or the obligation that might follow. Sometimes respect became a convenient disguise for distance. Sadie had no such manners. She had noticed that Ruth's curtains had not opened, that the familiar footsteps had not crossed the porch, and that the scent and rhythm of the morning were wrong. No miracle had whispered to her. She had simply paid attention more faithfully than the people around her. That evening, Michael brought Sadie home through a rain that had softened to mist. He dried her with a towel, filled her bowl, and watched her drag the towel into the living room, as if claiming payment for services rendered. The telephone rang. Claire's name appeared on the screen. The woman who reserved Sadie confirmed her trip. Claire said carefully, "She'll be here tomorrow morning." Michael looked at the small bed beside the sofa, the toys scattered beneath the table, and the blue leash hanging from the hook by the door. 14 days had ended. Sadie sat in front of him and began telling a bright, elaborate story, unaware that it might be the last one she would ever tell in that house. Morning arrived, clear and cold over Harrisonburg, the storm clouds finally breaking apart above the Blue Ridge. Water still clung to the bare trees, and thin sunlight flashed across the wet streets as Michael Turner drove toward the shelter, with Sadie secured beside him. The little German shepherd was nearly 11 weeks old now. Her black and tan coat had grown thicker, her paws still seemed too large for the rest of her body, and her stubborn left ear continued to lean sideways while the right stood at full attention. She talked through the first half of the drive, commenting on passing trucks and birds gathering along the power lines. Then, as the familiar brick shelter came into view, her voice faded. Michael kept both hands steady on the wheel, though his right shoulder had begun to ache before they left the house. He had packed Sadie's blanket, food bowl, rope toy, and rubber ring into a canvas bag. The blue leash remained clipped to her collar. Every object looked ordinary, yet together they felt like evidence of a life being dismantled. Michael reminded himself that fostering had always been temporary. 14 days had been written clearly on the agreement. He had known another person was coming. Knowledge, however, was a poor defense against attachment. Human beings often believed that naming an ending in advance would make it easier when it arrived. It rarely did. Claire Dawson was waiting near the reception desk when Michael entered. Her silver-streaked hair was tucked behind one ear, and her reading glasses hung from a cord against her green sweater. She greeted Sadie warmly, but her smile toward Michael carried the careful sympathy of someone who understood that kindness could feel humiliating when a person was trying not to grieve. "She's already here," Claire said quietly. Michael looked toward the row of chairs by the front windows. A woman sat alone with a folded red blanket in her lap. Eleanor Hayes was 69. slender without appearing fragile, with fair skin touched by small age spots and silver hair cut to her shoulders. Thin wire-framed glasses rested on a narrow nose, and her pale green eyes held the tired concentration of someone who had spent weeks refusing to surrender to uncertainty. She wore a soft gray coat over a dark blue dress and practical brown shoes marked with dried road salt. Her hands were elegant but restless, repeatedly smoothing the same crease in the faded blanket. The fabric had once been bright red. Time and washing had softened it toward rust, and one corner bore a row of tiny embroidered musical notes. Eleanor stood when she saw Michael. Before either adult could speak, Sadie noticed the blanket. The puppy froze. Her crooked ear lifted as high as it could. Her nose moved rapidly, drawing in a scent buried beneath detergent, old cedar, and the long miles Eleanor had carried it. Then Sadie pulled hard enough to make the leash slide through Michael's hand. She crossed the lobby, pressed her face into the blanket, and inhaled so deeply that the fabric folded around her muzzle. A sound came from her chest. It was not the bright chatter she used in the truck, nor the persistent checking voice Michael had heard in dark rooms. This voice was softer, almost trembling. Sadie pushed both front paws onto Eleanor's knees and continued speaking into the red cloth. Eleanor closed her eyes. Her hands settled around the puppy's shoulders. "Hello, Rosie," she whispered. Michael felt the name land inside him. "Rosie?" he asked. Eleanor looked up, tears standing behind her glasses. "That was her first name." They moved to a quiet room beside the lobby, where the shelter completed adoptions and difficult goodbyes. Claire brought coffee but left it untouched on the table. Sadie remained close to Eleanor, circling the red blanket and pressing her nose against every fold, as though searching for someone hidden inside it. "The blanket belonged to my sister, Margaret," Eleanor began. "Margaret Hayes. She was 75 when she died, though she would have corrected anyone who called her elderly. She said elderly was a word invented by people who wanted older women to stop having opinions." A small smile touched Eleanor's face. Margaret had been shorter and fuller-bodied than her sister, with thick white hair she wore in a loose braid, warm brown skin from years spent gardening, and dark eyes that remained lively even after her eyesight began to fail. She had taught music at a public elementary school in eastern Tennessee for 41 years. Former students remembered her for wearing bright scarves, tapping rhythm on desks with a wooden spoon, and refusing to believe any child was truly tone-deaf. Widowhood had made her quieter with strangers but more talkative at home. She filled silence by naming birds outside the window, arguing with radio hosts, and describing every meal to the dog lying beneath her kitchen table. That dog was a 4-year-old female German shepherd named Mara, large and deep-chested, with a dark saddle across her back, amber eyes, and one small notch in her right ear from an old fence injury. Mara had belonged to Margaret's late husband, but after his death, the dog became Margaret's constant companion. Mara was patient, watchful, and unusually vocal. She rarely barked without reason. Instead, she produced low grumbles and rising whines whenever Margaret stopped answering for too long. Margaret talked back, Eleanor said. That was the important part. They had entire conversations. My sister would call me, and halfway through a sentence she'd say, "Wait, Mara disagrees." Then I'd hear the dog muttering in the background. Sadie had been born in a sheltered stall behind Margaret's small timber house. Mara delivered 5 puppies on a night of heavy spring rain. Sadie was the smallest, recognizable from the beginning by her uneven ears and her habit of making noise even while nursing. Margaret named her Rosie because she liked to sleep with her nose tucked beneath the red blanket. As Margaret's eyesight worsened, she moved more carefully through the house. She sometimes failed to notice the kettle boiling or dropped objects she could not easily find. Mara learned to watch her breathing, footsteps, and voice. If Margaret sat too still or stopped responding, Mara would press against her legs and make those low, questioning sounds until she answered. Sadie copied her mother. At first, Margaret thought it was funny, Eleanor said. Then she began answering Rosie too. By 6 weeks, that puppy could hold up her end of an argument better than most people I know. Michael looked down. Sadie had curled partly on the blanket, her face turned toward Eleanor, while small sounds continued in her throat. One night, shortly before dawn, Margaret suffered a mild stroke in the kitchen. She fell beside the table and could not reach the telephone. Mara scratched at the front door until her paws bled against the wood, while Sadie climbed onto a chair near the window and cried with everything her small body could produce. The noise finally attracted a newspaper carrier named Thomas Green, a 56-year-old man with a narrow face, graying beard, and a permanent stoop from decades of lifting bundles before sunrise. Thomas was quiet by nature and had grown more observant after his wife died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He knew which houses usually had porch lights on, which customers waved, and which dogs barked only when something was wrong. When he heard Mara and saw the puppy throwing herself against the window, Thomas stopped his van, looked through the glass, and found Margaret on the floor. The doctors could not reverse everything the stroke had taken, but Margaret survived. Eleanor moved into the house and stayed for nearly 2 months. During those final weeks, Margaret could speak only in brief phrases. Mara lay beside her bed. Sadie slept under the red blanket near her feet and filled the quiet with soft, uneven sounds. Even when Margaret could no longer answer with full sentences, her fingers would move against the blanket as though keeping time with the puppy's voice. "She died with both dogs beside her," Eleanor said. "Peacefully. That part matters to me." After the funeral, heavy rain flooded the creek behind Margaret's property. A section of fencing collapsed while Eleanor was arranging transportation for Mara and the puppies. Neighbors found Mara and 4 of the young dogs, but Sadie was gone. Someone later reported seeing a small German shepherd near a service road. Animal control collected her, but her identification tag had been lost. She passed through 2 crowded facilities as counties shifted animals to make room after the flood. Each transfer shortened the record until Rosie, Margaret Hayes's puppy, became simply female German Shepherd mix, unknown origin. Eleanor searched for weeks. She called shelters across 3 states, posted photographs, and drove roads she had no reason to believe Sadie had traveled. People told her gently that perhaps the puppy had been adopted. They meant to offer comfort. To Eleanor, it sounded like permission to stop looking. Then she saw the shelter photograph from Harrisonburg. One ear was standing, Eleanor said. The other was leaning over, as if it had lost an argument, and those eyes looked exactly like Margaret's whenever someone suggested she rest. Eleanor reserved Sadie immediately. The delay had been necessary to arrange care for Mara, who now lived with Eleanor, but had developed complications after the flood and could not tolerate a long drive. Eleanor had not come merely to adopt a puppy. She had come to recover the last living piece of her sister's little house. The mornings of music, the kitchen conversations, and the red blanket folded at the foot of Margaret's bed. Michael could not resent her. That made the moment harder. He opened the canvas bag and showed Eleanor Sadie's food, toys, and notes about her routine. He explained that she woke early, disliked vacuum cleaners, believed shoes were communal property, and grew louder when someone skipped a meal. Eleanor listened carefully, laughing once through her tears. When there was nothing left to explain, Michael unclipped the blue leash from his wrist and placed it in Eleanor's hand. "She knows you," he said. Eleanor nodded. "She remembers the blanket." Michael stepped back. Eleanor moved toward the glass doors. Sadie caught one corner of the red fabric in her mouth and followed. She took 3 small steps, then stopped. Michael kept his face still. He would not call her. Love, he thought, should not become a contest between 2 people carrying different kinds of loss. Sadie released the blanket and turned, her eyes fixed on Michael. Then the low, steady checking voice began. The voice reserved for dark rooms, untouched meals, and people pretending they were still all right. Sadie's low, checking voice crossed the shelter lobby with none of the excitement she had shown toward the red blanket. Eleanor Hayes stood 3 steps from the glass doors, one hand holding the faded fabric and the other wrapped around the blue leash. Michael Turner remained near the adoption room doorway, his posture straight despite the ache in his shoulder and the heavier pain he refused to display. Between them, Sadie faced Michael and continued speaking in measured, patient phrases. The shelter around them seemed to quiet. Even the dogs farther down the corridor paused between barks, as though the building itself had begun to listen. Michael understood the voice now. It was the same one Sadie used when he skipped meals, trained until his hand trembled, or sat in a dark room pretending he had not disappeared inside himself. He knew what she was doing, and that knowledge made it more important that he remain still. "Go with Eleanor," he said softly.
Sadie answered him without moving.
Eleanor looked from the puppy to Michael.
"You can call her."
"No.
"She may come back if you do."
"That's why I won't." Michael's left hand closed around the strap of Sadie's canvas bag. Inside were the rope toy with the frayed end, the rubber ring scarred by tiny teeth, and the blanket Sadie had dragged from room to room. They were ordinary objects, but grief had never required valuable things. It only required proof that someone had been present. "You searched for her for weeks," Michael said. "I've known her 14 days.
14 days can matter."
"They do." His voice tightened, though he kept it low. "But this shouldn't become a contest over who misses more, who lost more, or who loves her better." Eleanor's fingers trembled against the leash. Michael looked at the red blanket. "She remembered your sister's home. She remembered that cloth before she reached you. I'm not going to use her concern for me to take that away." Human beings often turned love into evidence. They counted sacrifices, measured years, and presented pain as proof of ownership. Michael had seen families argue beside hospital beds because each person believed grief granted a greater claim. He would not make Sadie stand between two lonely people and decide whose wound was deeper. Eleanor slowly knelt in front of the puppy. At 69, her knees protested the movement, but she ignored the discomfort. She held Sadie's face between both hands and studied the uneven ears, the dark mask, and the bright eyes that had first reminded her of Margaret. "Rosie," Eleanor whispered. Sadie's voice softened for one breath, then returned to the steady checking rhythm. Her eyes remained fixed on Michael. Eleanor closed her own eyes and listened. She remembered the sound Sadie had made when she buried her nose in the red blanket. That voice had trembled with recognition. It belonged to warm kitchens, music drifting from an old radio, and Margaret's hand moving weakly against the cloth. Sadie had not rejected that memory. The puppy had pressed herself into it as though trying to enter a house that no longer stood in the same form. But the voice she used now was different. It was not the sound of a puppy asking to return to her beginning. It was the sound of a puppy checking whether someone nearby could still find his way out of silence. "You aren't asking me to take you home," Eleanor said. Sadie tilted her folded ear. "You're telling me he isn't all right." Michael looked toward the floor. "I'm fine." Sadie's voice grew louder. Eleanor gave a quiet, broken laugh. Apparently, she disagrees. The lobby doors opened behind them. Cold air swept across the floor, followed by Ruth Bennett and Laura. Ruth had been discharged from the hospital that morning after her blood pressure stabilized. She wore a long blue coat over a cream sweater, and a purple bruise showed faintly near her left temple. She moved more carefully than usual, one hand resting on Laura's arm, though her expression suggested she considered the assistance a temporary insult. Laura remained close to her mother without gripping too tightly. Her auburn hair was pulled into its usual neat knot, but exhaustion had softened the firm lines around her mouth. She had driven Ruth straight from the hospital because Ruth refused to let Michael face the handover alone. "You should be home resting," Michael said. Ruth stopped beside him. "And you should have eaten breakfast. It appears we are both disappointing people today." Laura glanced at Michael. "She threatened to call a taxi if I didn't bring her." "I did not threaten," Ruth said. "I explained the available consequences." Ruth did not ask Eleanor to surrender Sadie. He did not speak about the rescue across the street or describe how the puppy had found her on the kitchen floor. Ruth simply stood beside Michael until her shoulder almost touched his arm. Her presence asked for nothing and tried to solve nothing. It only made certain he was not standing alone. Eleanor rose slowly. She looked at Ruth's bruised face, then at Laura's careful posture. "You're the neighbor," she said. "I am," Ruth replied. "Ruth Bennett. This is my daughter, Laura." Eleanor introduced herself, and for several seconds the women studied one another with the quiet recognition shared by people who had learned that independence and loneliness were not opposites. "My husband died 7 years ago," Eleanor said. "Margaret was the person who called every evening afterward, even when neither of us had anything useful to say. After she died, I kept reaching for the telephone at 6:30. Ruth's expression softened. "Henry has been gone nearly 2 years. I still turn toward his chair whenever the weather report begins. He always argued with the forecast as though the clouds might reconsider. Margaret corrected television musicians from her living room. Henry corrected professional baseball players from his recliner. Laura looked between them. This could become a dangerous friendship. Neither older woman smiled immediately, but something eased in the space between them. Ruth told Eleanor about the library book club she had agreed to rejoin. She made the invitation carefully, without suggesting Eleanor needed rescuing. "If you come through Virginia again, we meet on Tuesdays. Half the members discuss the book. The other half discuss their knees. Both conversations are taken very seriously." Eleanor smiled then. "I might like that." They exchanged telephone numbers. It was not a promise that either woman would remove the other's grief. People could not repair an absence simply by placing another person beside it. But they could notice when the silence grew too long. They could call at 6:30. They could leave a chair available without staring at the empty one. Eleanor looked down at Sadie again. "I came here believing she was the last piece of Margaret's home." "She may be," Ruth said gently. "That is the problem." Eleanor touched the red blanket. "A living creature should not have to spend her life being someone else's memory." Michael looked up. Eleanor knelt once more and examined the corner of the blanket where a small brass tag had been sewn beneath the embroidered musical notes. The metal was scratched, but the name remained visible. Rosie. Eleanor carefully worked the old thread loose, removed the tag, and held it in her palm. "My sister loved this puppy," she said. "But Margaret never loved anything by keeping it where it was no longer needed." She fastened the old tag beside Sadie's new shelter identification on the puppy's collar. The two names rested together. Rosie from the house in Tennessee, Sadie from the shelter in Virginia. Neither erased the other. Eleanor then placed the blue leash back into Michael's left hand. "My sister would want her where that voice still matters." Michael's fingers closed around the handle, but he did not speak at once. Gratitude felt too small, and victory would have been the wrong emotion. Eleanor was giving him something she had crossed several states to recover. There was no clean happiness in such generosity, only love choosing not to become possession. Sadie looked up at Eleanor and produced one soft, trembling sentence. The voice of the red blanket and the old house. Eleanor bent and kissed the top of her head. "I remember too," she whispered. Sadie turned, crossed the small distance to Michael, and sat against his boot with her full weight leaning into him. Michael rested his hand between her uneven ears. Claire quietly gathered the paperwork at the desk. Laura placed an arm near Ruth without insisting that Ruth use it. Eleanor folded the red blanket once more, but this time she held it against her heart, rather than like something waiting to be returned. They were preparing to leave when Sadie suddenly stood. The puppy pulled the leash away from the glass doors and toward the kennel corridor. Michael followed as Sadie hurried past the first cages, ignoring the barking dogs and familiar staff. She stopped at the final kennel. Walter lay inside with his frosted muzzle on his paws. The old hound looked smaller than Michael remembered. His cloudy eyes opened, but his drooping ears did not react to the sounds around him. Sadie pressed her nose through the bars and began talking. Walter could not hear her. Still, after several low phrases, his tail moved once against the concrete, then again. Michael looked back toward the reception desk. A second leash hung from a hook beside Claire's chair. 3 weeks later, early spring reached Harrisonburg in cautious pieces. The mornings remained cold, but pale green buds appeared along the lower branches, and sunlight stayed long enough to warm the front steps of Michael Turner's rented house. Sadie had grown taller during those weeks, though her paws still looked borrowed from a much larger dog. Her right ear stood proudly, while the left continued to lean at the tip, preserving the expression of a serious puppy who had just heard something unreasonable. Michael had completed the adoption paperwork for Sadie, replaced the temporary shelter tag, and kept the old brass tag marked Rosie beside it. He had also repaired the gap beneath the backyard fence, moved his boots to a closet with a latch, and abandoned the foolish belief that the sofa belonged only to humans. Yet every few days, Sadie would stand at the front window, turn toward Michael, and produce the same low sound she had once used through the bars of Walter's kennel. She had not forgotten the old hound. Neither had Michael. On a bright Saturday morning, Michael drove back to Shenandoah County Animal Haven, with Sadie secured beside him. 2 blue leashes rested across the center console. Sadie talked for most of the drive, her pitch rising each time the shelter came closer. Claire Dawson met them near the entrance, wearing a yellow cardigan beneath her volunteer vest. Her silver-streaked hair had been tied loosely at the back, and her smile carried relief she did not attempt to hide. Walter had received little attention during the previous 3 weeks. Families admired his gentle face, then asked his age. When they learned he was 13, nearly death, and required medication for stiff joints, their interest softened into sympathy before moving toward younger kennels. "Walter has made no effort to improve his sales presentation," Claire said. "He has the right strategy," Michael replied. "Make them come to him." Walter lay on a blanket in the final kennel. His cloudy eyes opened when Sadie approached, but his drooping ears did not move. Sadie pressed her chest against the wire and began speaking. Walter's tail struck the floor once, then again. Michael had spent years evaluating risk, capability, and future demands. By every practical standard, adopting an elderly dog while recovering from an injury was inconvenient. Walter might need expensive care. He might struggle with stairs. He might have months rather than years. But human beings often used practicality to protect themselves from temporary love. They acted as though a short future made affection less worthwhile, when sometimes the shortness was precisely what made kindness urgent. Michael opened the kennel door and crouched beside Walter. The hound smelled his hand, then rested his white muzzle against Michael's wrist. Sadie climbed halfway into Michael's lap and continued her commentary. "I brought 2 leashes," Michael told Walter. "That means this meeting was mostly administrative." Walter did not hear him, but his tail moved again. The journey home took longer because Walter could not climb into the truck without help. Michael avoided lifting with his injured side and used a folding ramp Claire had provided. Walter approached it slowly, placed one paw on the surface, and looked back as if the entire arrangement lacked dignity. Sadie ran up and down the ramp 3 times to demonstrate, nearly falling off on the final attempt. Walter watched her, sighed through his nose, and walked into the truck with the weary patience of an old gentleman indulging a noisy child. At the house, Walter inspected little. He drank water, ignored the basket of toys, and discovered the sofa within 5 minutes. The best cushion received afternoon sunlight through the wide front window. Walter climbed onto it with help, turned once, and lowered himself with a groan that seemed to contain several opinions about stairs, weather, and youth. Sadie jumped beside him and immediately began talking near his face. Walter slept through every sound. He did not hear the front door open, the food bowl touch the floor, or Michael call his name from across the room. When Sadie barked at the vacuum cleaner, Walter continued sleeping. But when she stretched beside him, pressed her ribs against his side, and released one of her low, rolling murmurs, Walter's tail began to thump against the cushion. Michael watched from the kitchen doorway. Walter could not hear Sadie with his ears. He felt the vibration pass through her small chest and into his body, steady as a heartbeat that did not belong to him, but had chosen to remain nearby. Perhaps that was why Walter had responded through the kennel wall. Sadie's voice had never required understanding. It had only required contact. Life began reorganizing itself around the two dogs. Walter needed medication hidden inside pieces of chicken, though he always found the pill and deposited it neatly beside the bowl. Sadie considered this a magic trick and tried to steal both the chicken and the rejected medicine. Michael placed carpet runners across the slippery floors and built a low wooden step beside the sofa. Ruth supervised from the doorway, offering advice with the authority of someone who had never built anything more complicated than a library display. "That step is crooked," she said. "It's level. It looks emotionally crooked." Walter used it without complaint, which Michael accepted as the only inspection that mattered. Ruth had returned to the library book club. The first meeting frightened her more than she admitted. Laura drove her there but did not walk inside. Ruth entered alone, carrying Henry's old copy of the novel they were discussing. The chair beside hers remained empty, but Ruth placed her handbag on it rather than allowing everyone to treat it like a shrine. At the next meeting, a recently widowed woman paused in the doorway, uncertain where to sit. Ruth moved the handbag and invited her over. After that, Ruth always kept one chair available, not for Henry and not for absence, but for anyone who did not want to enter a room alone. Laura no longer called 5 times each day. She still phoned every morning before work, and Ruth answered even when the conversation lasted only 30 seconds. Trust did not mean ending all concern. It meant allowing concern to breathe without becoming a cage. Letters began arriving from Eleanor Hayes. She wrote in a graceful, slanting hand and enclosed photographs of Margaret, Mara, and the timber house in Tennessee. One showed Margaret seated at an upright piano, laughing while Mara leaned against her knee. Another showed 5 German Shepherd puppies beneath the red blanket, with tiny Rosie sleeping apart from the others, mouth open as if already delivering a speech. Eleanor eventually mailed the blanket itself. A note was folded inside. Memories should be used, not sealed away. Michael placed the faded red blanket across the back of the sofa. Beside it, he displayed a photograph of himself with Daniel Reed and 4 other teammates, taken before the training accident. For months, the picture had remained inside a box because Michael feared that looking at the past would trap him there. Now it stood openly in the living room, near the place where Walter slept and Sadie talked. The past had not vanished. It had simply stopped demanding darkness. The final decision about Michael's military future came in a formal meeting with Commander Rebecca Sloan. The nerve damage had improved, but not enough for his former operational duties. Michael listened without interrupting. The words still hurt, though they no longer sounded like the end of every useful part of him. Through Rebecca, Michael met Denise Harper, the director of a regional program connecting isolated veterans with rescue animals. Denise was 55. Broad-shouldered and compact, with deep brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and a calm face that rarely revealed surprise. A former Army social worker, she had spent 20 years working with veterans who resisted help because they believed needing anyone would cancel everything strong about them. Denise spoke plainly and disliked sentimental promises. "I don't need a hero," she told Michael during their first meeting. "I need someone who understands logistics, animal safety, and why a man can say he wants a dog when what he really wants is a reason to get out of bed." Michael accepted a position training volunteers, assessing homes, and helping match rescue animals with veterans who lived alone. The work was not the role he had lost. It demanded different muscles, including several he had neglected for years: patience, listening, and allowing people to make imperfect decisions without taking command of their lives. Sadie accompanied him to the first orientation. Before Michael could introduce himself, she stood beside his chair and delivered a long, raspy announcement to the room. Denise waited until Sadie finished. "Anything to add?" she asked Michael. "Apparently not." The veterans laughed and the tension eased. By early spring, Walter had claimed the sunny portion of the sofa as permanent territory. Ruth visited twice a week, Eleanor called on Sundays, and Laura occasionally joined them for dinner without rearranging Ruth's medicine cabinet. Michael still had difficult nights. Sadie still noticed. She did not cure him, and Walter did not become young again. Healing, Michael learned, was rarely a clean return to the person someone had been. More often, it was the slow construction of a life that could hold what had happened without collapsing beneath it. One evening, Michael sat on the sofa with Walter on one side and Sadie on the other. The windows were open slightly, carrying in the smell of damp soil and new leaves. Sadie raised her head and began a long, serious speech. Michael nodded at appropriate intervals and occasionally answered. "I agree," Sadie rumbled. "No, that part is unreasonable." Her voice rose sharply. "We'll discuss it tomorrow." Walter slept between them, his frosted muzzle resting on the red blanket. Each time Sadie's body vibrated against his side, his tail tapped slowly against the cushion. Sadie had never learned a single human word. She could not speak of loyalty, loss, or the doors people closed when they did not want anyone to see them weakened. But she had learned something more important than language. When someone begins sinking into silence, do not wait for them to learn how to ask for help. Come close enough for them to feel your presence, but do not pull them to their feet before they are ready. Stay, make a sound, and in whatever language the heart can still understand, say, "I am still here. You do not have to go through tonight alone." Sadie's gift was never that she could speak like a human. Her gift was that she paid attention when human beings stopped speaking. We often mistake silence for strength. We say, "They need space," because knocking on the door feels uncomfortable. We say, "They seem fine," because asking twice might require us to stay and listen. Yet many of life's quietest miracles begin when someone notices the unopened curtain, the untouched meal, or the smile that does not reach the eyes. Perhaps God does not always send help with thunder, angels, or answers we immediately recognize. Sometimes he sends a crooked-eared puppy who refuses to leave the room. Sometimes he uses an old neighbor, a phone call, an empty chair, or a trembling hand placed gently beside ours. The miracle is not that pain disappears. The miracle is that love finds us before silence convinces us we are alone. Look closely at the people around you. Someone may not need advice. They may simply need to hear, "I'm still here." Share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Tell us in the comments who has stayed beside you, and subscribe for more stories of hope, faith, and compassion. May God bless your home, protect those you love, and send light into every silent room.